I stared at my phone screen in complete disbelief. The text message glowed back at me from Mom's old number. "The mortgage is due." But Mom had been dead for 4 months. My brother Jake was using her phone now, the same Jake who had inherited everything while I got nothing. The golden child who received the house, the business, the entire family fortune was now desperately texting me for help. I sat in my tiny studio apartment surrounded by secondhand furniture and unpaid bills, while somewhere in California, Jake was drowning in the wealth that was supposed to be his destiny. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I learned early that being the older brother meant absolutely nothing in the Miller family hierarchy. Our father, David Miller, had built Miller & Sons Roofing from nothing over 30 years, transforming a beat-up pickup truck and a handful of tools into one of Colorado's most respected contracting businesses. Our mother, Patricia, had been a high school English teacher before becoming the company's bookkeeper, managing finances with the same precision she once used to grade essays. Jake was 3 years younger than me, but you would never know I was the firstborn from how our parents treated us. While I was learning responsibility and hard work, Jake was mastering the art of charm and natural talent. He glided through high school as the star quarterback maintaining straight A's, without ever appearing to crack a book. Teachers loved him, coaches praised him, and our parents spoke about him like he was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was the dependable one. From the time I turned 14, I spent every summer working for Dad's business. I learned to read blueprints, calculate materials, manage customer complaints, and handle the financial software that tracked our jobs. Dad would nod approvingly when I stayed late to finish paperwork or came in early to prep equipment, but his eyes truly lit up when he talked about Jake's future with the company. "Jake's got the vision," Dad would say during family dinners. "He understands people in ways that'll take this business to the next level." I remember the summer Jake turned 17 and crashed Dad's brand new Ford F-150 after a party. He'd been drinking, though we never talked about that part. The truck was totaled, and Jake spent 3 days in the hospital with a concussion. While he recovered from the trauma, I covered all his scheduled work shifts for the next 3 months, working 60-hour weeks to keep our contracts on schedule. Our parents praised me for being such a good brother and really stepping up for family, but they never once questioned why Jake had been drinking and driving in the first place. Instead, they bought him a different truck for his 18th birthday, reasoning that he'd learned his lesson and deserved a fresh start. The pattern continued through high school. When I graduated, I had earned a partial scholarship to Colorado State University to study business administration. I planned to complete my degree and return to help modernize Dad's company with proper project management systems and digital marketing strategies. But during my first semester, Dad suffered his initial heart attack. I remember standing in the hospital corridor, looking at Dad hooked up to monitors and oxygen machines while Mom cried softly in the plastic chair beside his bed. Jake was finishing his senior year and applying to colleges. Without hesitation, I withdrew from CSU and came home to run Miller & Sons while Dad recovered. For 18 months, I managed everything. I supervised job sites, handled payroll, maintained equipment, and dealt with insurance companies. I worked 16-hour days and learned aspects of the business that Dad had never trusted anyone else to handle. When Dad finally returned to work, the company was more profitable than it had ever been. Instead of acknowledging my sacrifice, our parents announced that Jake would attend the University of Colorado Boulder to study business management, fully funded by the company's profits. They explained that Jake needed proper education to eventually take over as owner and president. "Trent's done amazing work," Dad said during the family meeting where they revealed this plan. "But Jake has the natural leadership qualities and education that'll carry us into the future." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. After sacrificing my own education and essentially saving the family business, I was being told that my younger brother was more qualified to lead simply because of his charisma and a degree he hadn't even earned yet. Jake seemed genuinely surprised by the announcement, but he didn't object. He'd grown accustomed to being handed opportunities without question. That fall, He moved to Boulder and began a college experience funded entirely by the business I'd been running. Over the next 4 years, I continued working for Dad while Jake studied. I developed relationships with our biggest clients, implemented new safety protocols that reduced our insurance costs, and expanded our services to include commercial projects. Linda Walsh, who managed properties for several local businesses, became one of our most valuable customers because she trusted my attention to detail and honest communication. Jake visited during breaks and summers, usually working light duty, while regaling Dad with stories about his business courses and internship experiences. He had a natural way of talking about industry trends and management theories that impressed our parents, even though I was the one actually implementing practical solutions to real problems. During Jake's senior year, Dad's health began declining again. His second heart attack was milder, but his doctor recommended reducing stress and physical activity. For the past 12 months, I'd essentially been running Miller & Sons alone, while Dad focused on recovery and spending time with Mom. I thought surely this would demonstrate my capability and commitment to our parents. I was wrong. 3 days after Jake's college graduation ceremony, Dad called me into his office. Mom was there too, both wearing serious expressions that made my heart sink. "Son," Dad began, "you've been incredible these past few years. We couldn't have kept the business running without you." I felt a brief surge of hope, thinking they were finally going to acknowledge my contributions and leadership. But Jake's got his degree now, and he's ready to take on more responsibility. We're going to start transitioning ownership to him over the next few years. The words hit me like ice water. After 8 years of building relationships, learning every aspect of the business, and sacrificing my own educational and career opportunities, they were handing everything to Jake, simply because he'd completed a business management program. "What does that mean for me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom reached over and patted my hand. "You'll always have a place here, sweetheart. Jake will need experienced people he can trust." So, I would work for my younger brother in the company I'd been running successfully for years. The golden child was coming home to claim his inheritance, and I was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve under him. That night, Jake called to thank me for keeping everything together while he was in school. He assured me that we'd be partners, and that he valued my experience. But there was something in his tone, a casual confidence, that told me he truly believed he deserved this opportunity more than I did. Our parents had spent so many years telling him he was destined for leadership that he'd never questioned whether he'd actually earned it. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday morning in March. I was reviewing estimates for a commercial roofing project when my neighbor Mrs. Peterson called to tell me there had been an accident. My parents were driving back from Jake's graduation ceremony at the University of Colorado Boulder when their car hit black ice on Highway 6. The state trooper said they died instantly. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a haze of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and the overwhelming silence of a house that had always been filled with Mom's laughter and Dad's stories about job sites. Jake flew home from California, where he'd been celebrating his graduation with friends, and we stumbled through the services together. People from the community filled the church. Dad had roofed half the houses in our neighborhood, and Mom had taught 3 generations of local kids. Clients like Linda Walsh spoke about Dad's integrity and craftsmanship, while former students shared memories of Mom's patience and encouragement. Through it all, I kept thinking about how proud our parents would have been to see this outpouring of respect for their life's work. The business Dad built hadn't just provided for our family, it had become part of the community's foundation. 3 weeks after the funeral, Jake and I sat in the waiting room of Henderson & Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal matters for 15 years. Attorney Richard Henderson had been Dad's friend since high school, and I expected this meeting to be a formality. We'd probably inherit everything jointly, or maybe there would be specific instructions about transitioning the business to Jake, as Dad had planned. Henderson's office hadn't changed in all the years I'd been coming here for business meetings. The same leather chairs faced his massive oak desk, and the walls displayed his law degree from the University of Denver, alongside photos of fishing trips and charity golf tournaments. When Henderson entered, he looked unusually uncomfortable. He'd always been cheerful and confident during our previous meetings, but today, he avoided eye contact as he arranged papers on his desk. "Boys," he began, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your parents were good people who loved both of you very much." I felt Jake shift nervously in the chair beside me. Neither of us spoke. Henderson opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents. "Your parents updated their will 2 years ago. I advised them to discuss these decisions with both of you beforehand, but they felt it was better to handle things this way." My stomach began to twist with an inexplicable dread. The family residence at 412 Maple Street, appraised at $850,000, is bequeathed to Jake Miller. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Our childhood home, where I'd lived my entire life, where I'd been taking care of the yard and maintenance for years, was going exclusively to Jake. Miller & Sons Roofing, including all equipment vehicles, client contracts, and business assets, is bequeathed to Jake Miller. The words felt surreal. The business I'd been running, the relationships I'd built, the systems I'd created, were all being handed to Jake without any recognition of my contributions. The retirement accounts and savings totaling approximately $400,000 are bequeathed to Jake Miller. Henderson's voice seemed to be coming from underwater. I couldn't process what I was hearing. All vehicles and personal property are bequeathed to Jake Miller. I looked at Jake, expecting to see him as shocked as I was, but his expression showed surprise, mixed with something else. Acceptance, maybe even relief, that his inheritance was finally being formalized. To Trent Miller. Henderson continued, his voice softer now. Your parents leave their heartfelt love and gratitude for his faithful service to the family. The silence in the office was deafening. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, sacrificed education, missed opportunities, and complete dedication had earned me heartfelt love and gratitude, while Jake received every tangible asset our parents had built. Henderson cleared his throat. There's also a personal letter for each of you. He handed us sealed envelopes with our names written in Mom's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened mine. Dearest Trent. The letter began, We know this might be difficult to understand, but we believe Jake needs the structure and responsibility that comes with ownership. You've always been so capable and independent that we know you'll build something wonderful for yourself. Your work ethic and integrity are gifts that no inheritance can match. We love you more than words can express. I read the letter 3 times, trying to find some acknowledgement of my sacrifices or explanation for why 8 years of running their business apparently qualified me for nothing more than gratitude. Jake finished reading his letter and looked up with eyes that seemed genuinely troubled. Trent, I had no idea they were planning this. We'll figure something out. You know I consider you a partner. But even as he spoke those words, I could see him mentally calculating what he'd inherited. The house alone would sell for nearly $1 million in Denver's current market. The business had generated over $1,200,000 in revenue last year, and our client base was the most loyal in the region. Henderson spoke again, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I should mention that I advised your parents to discuss this with both of you beforehand. They were concerned about Jake's readiness for this level of responsibility, but they felt that giving him ownership would provide the motivation he needed to step up. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Even our parents had doubts about Jake's ability to handle the inheritance, but they'd given it to him anyway, hoping it would transform him into the leader they wanted him to be. After we signed the paperwork and left Henderson's office, Jake suggested we get dinner to talk about the future. But I needed time alone to process what had just happened. I drove to the job site, where we were replacing the roof on Linda Walsh's office building, one of the projects I'd been managing for months. Sitting in my truck, looking at the building where I'd spent countless hours ensuring every detail met our quality standards, I realized that everything I'd built was now Jake's property. The relationships with clients like Linda, the reputation for reliability and craftsmanship, The systems that made Miller and Sons profitable had all been transferred to someone who'd spent the last 4 years studying theoretical business management, while I learned through actual experience. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Bro, let's talk tomorrow. I want to make this work for both of us." But I knew the reality of our new dynamic. Jake owned everything, and I owned nothing. Any role I had going forward would be entirely dependent on his generosity and goodwill. That evening, I walked through our parents' house one last time before Jake arrived to claim his inheritance. Every room held memories of a childhood where I'd tried desperately to earn the same level of approval that came so naturally to my younger brother. Looking at family photos on the mantle, I noticed something I'd never seen before. In every picture, our parents' eyes seemed to follow Jake, their expressions showing a pride and anticipation that was somehow different from how they looked at me. Even in family snapshots, the favoritism that had shaped our entire lives was visible. I spent that night in the room where I'd grown up, knowing it would be my last. Tomorrow, Jake would officially become the owner of everything our parents had built, and I would become just another employee in the business I'd been successfully running for years. The golden child was finally coming home to claim his throne. Jake's fiancée Madison arrived from California 3 days after the will reading, stepping out of an Uber at our family home like she was surveying newly acquired territory. I was loading my belongings into my beat-up Honda Civic when her designer luggage hit the front porch. Madison Caldwell was everything Jake's college stories had promised: gorgeous, confident, and completely unimpressed by anything that didn't meet her Beverly Hills standards. She wrinkled her nose at the neighborhood's modest ranch houses and mature trees, clearly seeing suburban Denver as a temporary inconvenience, rather than the community where Jake had grown up. "This house has good bones," she announced after her initial walkthrough, "but we'll need to stage it properly for a quick sale." Jake nodded eagerly, apparently having already decided that his inheritance was merely seed money for their California dreams. They'd been dating for 2 years, and Madison had made it clear that their future lay in Los Angeles, where her father owned several commercial development companies. "Richard Caldwell doesn't do small-time residential work," she explained to me, while Jake loaded my father's tools into his new truck. "When we move to California, Jake will have opportunities in real commercial real estate development. This little roofing business is just startup capital." I bit my tongue, remembering that this little roofing business had supported both families for 3 decades and was currently generating more revenue than it ever had under my management. Within a week of taking ownership, Jake began making changes that horrified everyone who'd worked with Miller and Sons for years. His first decision was firing Carlos Rodriguez, our lead foreman, who'd been with the company for 12 years. Carlos had started as an apprentice when I was still in high school, and Dad had trusted him to supervise our most complex commercial projects. "We need to modernize our approach," Jake explained when I questioned the decision. "Carlos is set in old-fashioned methods. I'm bringing in younger guys who understand current construction techniques." The younger guys turned out to be recent trade school graduates who would work for significantly less money than experienced roofers. Jake had calculated that cutting labor costs by 30% would increase profit margins dramatically, at least on paper. The reality was catastrophic. Our first job under Jake's new crew was replacing the roof on Linda Walsh's medical office complex, a project I'd carefully planned for months. The inexperienced workers struggled with the complex drainage systems and failed to properly seal the transitions between different roof sections. When Denver's spring rains arrived, Linda's building leaked in 4 different places, damaging expensive medical equipment and forcing her to close the practice for 3 days. She called me directly, furious and confused about why Miller and Sons had suddenly delivered such poor workmanship. I tried explaining that there had been personnel changes, but Linda cut me off. "Trent, I've worked with your family for 8 years because of the quality and reliability. If that's no longer what Miller and Sons represents, I'll have to find another contractor." Jake dismissed Linda's complaints as growing pains and blamed the leaks on unusual weather patterns. He seemed genuinely puzzled that customers expected the same level of quality they'd received when Dad and I were supervising jobs personally. Meanwhile, Jake was spending the inheritance money like it was unlimited. The $25,000 engagement ring he bought Madison featured a 2-carat diamond that she flashed to anyone who'd pay attention. His new BMW cost $65,000, replacing the practical Ford pickup that Dad had used for business calls. Most extravagantly, Jake booked their wedding venue at an exclusive resort in Malibu, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The initial quote was $50,000, but Madison's vision included upgrades that pushed the total cost toward $80,000. "It's an investment in our future," Jake explained when I expressed concern about the expenses. Madison's father is connected to major development projects throughout Southern California. This wedding is really a networking opportunity. I was surviving on my savings and the small salary from my new job as an assistant manager at Home Depot, while watching Jake burn through money that could have sustained the business through several difficult years. But I was also discovering aspects of life outside the family business that I'd never had time to explore. Working at Home Depot introduced me to different types of construction projects and customer service challenges. My supervisor, Frank Morrison, was a retired contractor who recognized my experience and suggested I teach evening classes in construction management at the local community college. "You've got practical knowledge that these trade school kids need," Frank explained. "Teaching would supplement your income and keep you connected to the industry." The teaching opportunity led to meeting Sarah Chen, a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, who was taking night classes in business administration. She'd noticed me struggling with advanced accounting concepts and offered to help with my homework in exchange for tutoring in the construction management principles I was teaching. Sarah was everything Madison wasn't: practical, genuinely kind, and interested in building something meaningful rather than simply acquiring luxury. Our relationship developed, slowly built on shared values and mutual respect rather than financial attraction or social status. She listened patiently when I explained the family dynamics that had led to my current situation, and she helped me process the grief and anger in healthy ways rather than simply festering in resentment. "It sounds like your parents made mistakes," she said after hearing the complete story, "but holding on to bitterness will only hurt you. Maybe this situation is forcing you to discover what you're truly capable of on your own." Meanwhile, Jake's mismanagement of Miller & Sons accelerated. He fired 2 more longtime employees, including our bookkeeper, who'd worked with Mom for 8 years, replacing her with automated software that he struggled to operate effectively. Customer complaints multiplied as job quality declined. Jake's cost-cutting measures had eliminated the safety margins that Dad had always built into projects, resulting in shortcuts that caused long-term problems. When clients called with issues, Jake often became defensive rather than taking responsibility for substandard work. Former customers began recommending other contractors to their friends and colleagues, erosion that would take years to reverse, even if Jake suddenly improved his practices. But Jake was focused on California and his upcoming wedding rather than the deteriorating business he'd inherited. He seemed to believe that his natural charisma and business school education would eventually overcome any temporary setbacks. The breaking point came when he announced plans to take a $200,000 loan against the family house to fund the wedding expenses and their relocation to Los Angeles. When I suggested this was financially dangerous, Jake dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're thinking too small," he said. "Madison's father has development projects worth millions of dollars. This loan is just bridge financing until I get established in California commercial real estate." Richard Caldwell. Madison's father had been polite, but distinctly unimpressed during their holiday visit to Denver. He'd asked detailed questions about Miller & Sons' financial performance, and Jake's vague answers about transitional challenges and modernization growing pains hadn't inspired confidence. But Jake remained convinced that his inheritance and marriage to Madison would open doors to opportunities beyond anything possible in Colorado. He saw the roofing business as outdated and limiting, something to be liquidated rather than preserved and grown. Standing in the empty office where I'd spent countless hours managing schedules, processing invoices, and building client relationships, I realized that Jake's inheritance had revealed his true character. Without the structure and supervision that our parents had provided, he was making decisions based on fantasy and immediate gratification rather than practical long-term planning. The golden child who'd seemed destined for success was actually completely unprepared for the responsibilities that had been handed to him. And the family legacy that 3 generations had built was being dismantled by someone who'd never understood its true value. The text message I would eventually receive was still months away, but the foundation for that desperate plea was already being laid through Jake's reckless financial decisions and naive assumptions about his future prospects. By late spring, the scope of Jake's mismanagement became impossible to ignore. Miller and Sons had lost 6 major commercial accounts, including 3 apartment complex projects that Carlos Rodriguez's crew had successfully completed for years. The new workers Jake hired lacked experience with commercial-grade materials and specialized installation techniques required for larger buildings. The disaster at Riverside Shopping Center exemplified Jake's failing leadership. The mall's management company had contracted us to replace roofing on 4 retail buildings, a project worth $200,000 that should have established Miller and Sons' reputation for handling complex commercial work. Instead, Jake's inexperienced crew failed to properly install drainage systems, causing water to pool during Colorado's heavy spring storms. When the ceiling collapsed in Peterson Electronics, destroying thousands of dollars worth of merchandise, Riverside's management immediately terminated our contract and demanded compensation for damages. Jake's response was to hire a lawyer and fight the claim rather than taking responsibility for obvious workmanship failures. The legal bills alone consumed $15,000 before Jake finally agreed to a settlement that included paying for all damaged inventory, plus the cost of hiring another contractor to complete the work properly. Word spread quickly through Denver's commercial property management community that Miller and Sons was no longer reliable for major projects. Meanwhile, Jake's wedding preparations escalated into elaborate excess that would have impressed Madison's Beverly Hills friends, but drained resources the failing business desperately needed. The Malibu resort charged additional fees for every detail Madison considered essential: upgraded floral arrangements, premium bar service, photographers' travel expenses, and custom lighting that transformed the venue into her vision of sophisticated elegance. Jake seemed oblivious to the irony that he was funding luxury wedding expenses with money from a business he was simultaneously destroying through neglect and poor decision-making. Madison's father, Richard Caldwell, visited Denver in June to assess Jake's business acumen before the wedding. Jake proudly gave him a tour of our equipment yard and office, apparently expecting Richard to be impressed by the company's physical assets and established client base. Richard's questions revealed a sharp business mind that immediately identified problems Jake had been ignoring or explaining away. How many repeat customers had contracted for additional work this year? What was the average profit margin on residential versus commercial projects? Which competitors had gained market share? And why were clients choosing alternative contractors? Jake's answers were vague and defensive. He blamed lost customers on market fluctuations and seasonal variations, rather than acknowledging quality control issues or pricing mistakes. When Richard asked to review financial statements, Jake provided summaries that obscured declining revenue and increasing costs. After 2 days of meetings, Richard took Jake and Madison to dinner at Denver's most expensive restaurant. I wasn't invited, but Jake called me afterward, clearly shaken by whatever conversation had occurred. Richard has some concerns about the business transition period, Jake admitted. He thinks maybe I should gain more hands-on experience before expanding into California markets. The translation was obvious. Madison's father had recognized Jake's incompetence and was reconsidering whether his daughter should marry someone who'd inherited wealth he couldn't manage effectively. Madison's reaction was immediate and brutal. Within a week of her father's visit, she began questioning every aspect of their relationship and future plans. The confident woman who'd been planning elaborate California social events suddenly seemed uncertain about Jake's prospects and character. Their arguments became frequent and public. Madison complained that Jake had misrepresented his business success and financial stability. Jake countered that she'd never supported the Colorado business and only wanted access to her father's development opportunities. The breaking point came during a 4th of July party at the family house. Madison had invited several California friends to see their quaint Colorado lifestyle before the wedding, but the evening became an humiliating disaster when Linda Walsh confronted Jake about ongoing problems with her medical office roof. 6 months of repairs, and we're still experiencing leaks, Linda announced in front of Madison's sophisticated friends. Your father and Trent would have never delivered such shoddy workmanship. Madison's friends watched this confrontation with obvious discomfort, clearly wondering how their host could be failing so badly at managing his inherited business. The image of Jake as a successful business owner crumbled in real time, replaced by evidence that he was incompetent and irresponsible. 2 days after the party, Madison called off their engagement. She returned the expensive ring and announced she was moving back to California to work for her father's company. Her final conversation with Jake was brief and decisive. "You're not the person I thought I was marrying," she told him over the phone while I helped load her belongings into a rental car. "My father was right about your business judgment, and I can't build a future with someone who destroys everything he inherits." Jake was devastated, but also angry, convinced that Madison had never truly loved him and only wanted his inheritance money. He seemed unable to recognize that his poor business decisions had created the financial instability that destroyed their relationship. Alone in California and burning through money on expensive apartment rent, Jake attempted to salvage both his business and personal life. He hired a marketing consultant to rebrand Miller & Sons with modern advertising and social media presence, spending $8,000 on website design and promotional materials that couldn't compensate for the company's damaged reputation. The rebranding campaign featured professional photos of Jake in business suits, standing beside expensive equipment, positioning him as a next-generation leader, bringing innovation to traditional construction. But potential customers cared more about quality references and reliable completion schedules than flashy marketing promises. By August, Miller & Sons' annual revenue had dropped to less than $400,000, down from the $1,200,000 I generated the previous year. Jake was covering business expenses and his California lifestyle costs by borrowing against the family house, accumulating debt that grew larger each month. Carlos Rodriguez and other experienced former employees had found positions with competitors, taking their skills and client relationships to businesses that valued quality workmanship. Several customers specifically requested that their projects be handled by Carlos's new crew, rather than Miller & Sons' inexperienced workers. Jake's isolation in California amplified his poor decision-making. Without local advisors or family members to provide perspective, he made increasingly desperate attempts to restore profitability through cost-cutting measures that actually reduced the company's capability to deliver satisfactory work. He sold 2 of our best trucks to generate immediate cash, leaving crews without reliable transportation to job sites. He eliminated liability insurance coverage that Dad had considered essential, gambling that serious accidents wouldn't occur during the cost-saving period. Most dangerously, Jake began accepting jobs that exceeded his crew's abilities, bidding on complex commercial projects without understanding the technical requirements or potential risks involved. When these jobs failed, the resulting legal liability and repair costs exceeded any possible profit margins. The house of cards that Jake had built from his inheritance was beginning to collapse under the weight of his unrealistic expectations and fundamental incompetence. The desperate text message about overdue mortgage payments was still months away, but the foundation for that crisis was solidifying through accumulated debt, destroyed business relationships, and financial obligations that far exceeded Jake's ability to generate revenue. Standing in my small apartment watching news reports about Denver's booming construction industry, while knowing that Miller & Sons was failing spectacularly, I realized that Jake's inheritance had become his curse, rather than his blessing. The wealth and opportunities that should have secured his future were being destroyed by the same character flaws that our parents had overlooked throughout his charmed adolescence. October arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed Denver in 6 inches of powder, creating immediate demand for roof inspections and emergency repairs. It should have been Miller and Son's busiest season, but Jake was 3,000 miles away in Santa Monica, struggling to manage a Colorado business from a one-bedroom apartment that cost $3,800 per month. His attempts to run operations remotely were predictably disastrous. Customer calls went unanswered because Jake was sleeping during Colorado's business hours, and emergency service requests piled up while he tried to coordinate responses from California. When clients needed immediate attention for storm damage or heating system problems, Miller and Sons simply wasn't available. Meanwhile, my life in Denver had stabilized in ways I'd never expected. Frank Morrison promoted me to assistant store manager at Home Depot, recognizing my ability to help customers solve complex construction problems. The teaching position at Front Range Community College had expanded to 2 courses per semester, providing additional income and connecting me with young people eager to learn practical skills. Most importantly, my relationship with Sarah had deepened into something genuine and lasting. We'd moved in together to a modest apartment near Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, splitting expenses and supporting each other's professional goals. Sarah was completing her business administration degree while working full-time as a nurse, and I was considering pursuing my own education in construction management. For the first time since high school, I was building a life based on my own choices, rather than family obligations and inherited expectations. The freedom was both exhilarating and frightening. Carlos Rodriguez had started his own roofing company, Rodriguez and Associates, and several former Miller and Sons employees had joined him. He'd approached me about becoming a partner, offering to handle field operations, while I managed business development and client relations. "You know these customers better than anyone," Carlos explained during lunch at our old favorite Mexican restaurant. "Linda Walsh has been asking when you're going to start your own company, so she can hire you for her projects." I'd been saving money, carefully accumulating $18,000 that could serve as startup capital for equipment and initial operating expenses. Sarah supported the idea of entrepreneurship, understanding that working for myself offered better long-term prospects than retail management. But I was still processing the grief of losing my parents and the betrayal of being excluded from their legacy. Starting a competing business felt like abandoning hope that Jake might recognize his mistakes and invite me back as a true partner rather than subordinate employee. That emotional conflict was resolved by a series of phone calls that revealed the true depth of Jake's desperation. His first call came on a Tuesday evening, while Sarah and I were cooking dinner together. Jake's voice sounded strained and tired, lacking the confident energy that had characterized our previous conversations. "How's everything going in Denver?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Fine," I replied cautiously. "Work is good. Sarah and I are doing well. How's California treating you?" "Great, really great. Madison and I are working through some temporary issues, but her father's got several projects that could be perfect for expanding Miller and Sons into commercial development." I knew Madison had returned her engagement ring and moved back with her parents, but I didn't challenge Jake's version of reality. "Actually," Jake continued, "I'm calling because there might be some short-term cash flow challenges with the business. You know how seasonal variations affect construction revenue." The euphemisms couldn't disguise what he was really saying. Miller and Sons was running out of money. "What kind of challenges?" I asked. "Nothing serious, just timing issues with some larger payments. I was wondering if you might be available to help with some administrative tasks, maybe handle customer calls during Colorado business hours." Jake was offering me temporary employment in the business I'd been running successfully for years. The irony was almost too absurd to process. "I'm pretty committed to my current responsibilities," I told him, "but I hope you get things figured out." 3 weeks later, Jake called again. This time his tone was more urgent and less pretentious. "Trent, I need to be honest with you about some problems. The house payments are getting behind, and there've been some unexpected legal expenses from that shopping center situation. How far behind? I asked. 3 months, maybe 4. But I've got several big jobs lined up for spring that'll get everything caught up. 4 months behind on a $4,200 mortgage meant Jake owed nearly $17,000 in overdue payments, not including late fees and potential legal costs, for a house he'd inherited free and clear just 8 months earlier. Have you talked to the bank about restructuring the loan? I suggested. They're being pretty inflexible. Look, I know this is awkward, but would you consider co-signing for a short-term bridge loan just until the spring contracts start generating revenue? Jake was asking me to guarantee debt he'd created through mismanaging the inheritance I'd been excluded from receiving. The request revealed both his financial desperation and his continuing assumption that I should sacrifice my own security for his benefit. I can't co-sign for loans, Jake. I'm just getting my own finances stabilized. Right, of course, I understand. But I could hear in his voice that he didn't understand at all. Jake still expected family loyalty to override practical considerations and personal boundaries. The final call came in early December. Jake's voice was barely controlled panic disguised as casual conversation. Quick question about some business stuff, he began. Do you remember the paperwork Dad used for that line of credit against the house a few years ago? The question sent ice through my veins. Dad had established an emergency credit line during his recovery period, allowing the business to access funds if unexpected expenses arose. But that credit line required 2 signatures for activation: the business owner and a designated family member. Why are you asking about that? I said carefully. Just reviewing all the financial options available, making sure I understand everything Dad set up. After hanging up, I drove immediately to Henderson & Associates and asked to review the credit line documentation. Richard Henderson looked uncomfortable as he explained the terms. Your father established this as emergency financing, Henderson said. It requires authorization from both the business owner and a family member. Since Jake inherited the business, he can access the credit line, but it also requires your signature as the designated family representative. Has Jake asked you about this? Henderson's expression confirmed my suspicions. He's inquired about the process, but no applications have been submitted. I realized Jake was considering forging my signature to access $75,000 in emergency credit. The same brother who'd inherited everything was now desperate enough to consider fraud as a solution to problems he'd created through his own poor judgment. That evening, while Sarah studied for her final exams, I sat in our small kitchen trying to process how dramatically everything had changed. 8 months ago, Jake had inherited over $2 million in assets and a thriving business. Now, he was apparently considering forgery to avoid losing the family home to foreclosure. The golden child who'd seemed destined for effortless success had revealed himself to be completely unprepared for adult responsibilities. His inheritance hadn't provided security and opportunity. It had exposed character flaws that our parents' favoritism had hidden throughout his adolescence. 2 days before Christmas, my phone buzzed with a text message from Mom's old number, the one Jake had kept as a memento. The mortgage is due. 4 simple words that represented the collapse of everything Jake had inherited, and the moment when his desperation finally exceeded his pride. I stared at the message for several minutes, remembering the teenager who'd crashed Dad's truck and emerged without consequences, the college student who'd been funded while I sacrificed my education, and the heir who'd been chosen, despite never demonstrating the competence to handle such responsibility. My phone buzzed again with another message. Can we talk? For the first time since our parents died, Jake was asking rather than expecting. The golden child was finally ready to admit he needed help from the brother he'd taken for granted his entire life. I typed back carefully. I'll handle the mortgage. We need to meet in person. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. family house. Come alone. It was time for the reckoning that should have happened years earlier, before Jake's sense of entitlement destroyed everything our parents had built. Jake's flight from Los Angeles landed at Denver International Airport on a gray December afternoon that matched his subdued demeanor when I picked him up in my Honda Civic. He looked exhausted and thinner than I remembered, his expensive California wardrobe wrinkled, and his usual confident posture replaced by nervous fidgeting. The drive to our childhood home was mostly silent, punctuated only by Jake's occasional comments about changes in the neighborhood. But I could sense him preparing arguments and justifications for the conversation ahead, still hoping to manage the situation through charm and manipulation, rather than honest accountability. I'd spent the morning reviewing documents that Henderson had helped me compile over the past week. The evidence of Jake's financial mismanagement was comprehensive, and damning forged signatures on loan applications, diverted business funds for personal expenses, and unauthorized debt that exceeded the company's actual assets. Most seriously, Jake had indeed forged my signature on the $75,000 credit line application. Henderson had discovered this when the bank called to verify my authorization for such a large loan. The forgery wasn't just unethical, it was criminal fraud that could result in federal charges if I chose to pursue prosecution. Sarah had helped me prepare for this confrontation, encouraging me to approach it as an intervention rather than revenge. "Your brother is drowning in consequences of his own choices," she'd said. "You have an opportunity to throw him a rope, but only if he's willing to grab it and do the work to save himself." When we arrived at the house, Jake immediately began explaining his perspective before I'd even closed the front door. "Look, I know things seem bad right now, but I've learned a lot from these challenges. Madison and I are working on reconciling, and her father's warming up to some partnership possibilities. If I can just get through this temporary cash flow problem, everything will turn around." I let him continue while I arranged papers on the kitchen table, where we'd eaten thousands of family dinners. Jake's voice became increasingly animated as he outlined various scenarios for recovery, all of which depended on external factors beyond his control and ignored the fundamental problems with his decision-making. "The point is," he concluded, "I just need to restructure some of the debt temporarily. Maybe you could help with a short-term loan, or we could work out a partnership arrangement where you come back to Miller & Sons in a management capacity." When he finished, I placed the loan application documents in front of him, with the forged signature clearly highlighted. "Before we talk about partnerships," I said quietly, "we need to discuss this." Jake's face went white as he recognized his own handiwork. For several seconds he said nothing, apparently calculating whether to deny responsibility or attempt justification. "I was going to talk to you about that," he finally said. "It was just a temporary measure to avoid foreclosure, while I figured out other options." "It's fraud, Jake. You forged my signature to access $75,000 in credit without my knowledge or permission." The word fraud seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Jake's entire demeanor shifted from defensive confidence to genuine fear as he realized the potential legal consequences of his actions. "Are you going to report me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That depends on what happens in the next hour," I said. I spread out additional documents showing the complete scope of Miller & Sons' financial collapse, outstanding debts, lost contracts, legal liabilities, and monthly expenses that exceeded revenue by significant margins. "Jake, you've destroyed everything our parents built. The business that supported two families for 30 years is essentially bankrupt. The house you inherited free and clear now has $200,000 in debt attached to it. Customers who trusted our family's reputation for 3 decades won't work with Miller & Sons anymore." Each statement was supported by specific evidence that Jake couldn't dispute or explain away. The numbers painted a picture of systematic mismanagement that went far beyond simple inexperience. "But here's what we're going to do," I continued. "I'm prepared to save the house and rebuild the business, but only under specific conditions that are non-negotiable." I handed him a legal document that Henderson had prepared based on our discussions throughout the week. "First, you immediately transfer ownership of the house and all remaining business assets to me. The debts you've accumulated become my responsibility, and you relinquish any claim to future profits or property appreciation. Jake started to object, but I continued before he could speak. Second, you enter a 90-day residential treatment program for financial addiction and alcohol dependency. Don't deny the drinking, Jake. I can smell it on you right now, and Henderson's research shows 3 DUI citations in California over the past 4 months. Jake's shock at being caught confirmed what I'd suspected about his deteriorating behavior. Third, when you complete treatment, you work for my company at standard employee wages. No special treatment, no management role, no family privileges. You learn the business from the ground up, the way I did, starting with basic construction labor. Jake was staring at the documents with growing comprehension of how completely his life was about to change. Fourth, after 5 years of demonstrated reliability and competence, I'll sell you back 49% of the business at fair market value. Not 51%, not equal partnership, but the opportunity to earn a substantial stake through actual contribution rather than inheritance. The final provision addressed the most important aspect of our new relationship. Fifth, you acknowledge publicly that your poor decisions created this crisis, and you take full responsibility for the damage to our family's reputation and our employees' livelihoods. Jake read through the agreement twice, his hands shaking slightly as the implications settled in. Everything he'd inherited was being transferred to the brother he'd always taken for granted, and his future role would depend entirely on proving himself worthy through hard work and changed behavior. What if I refuse? He asked. Then, I report the forgery to federal authorities, and you face criminal prosecution for bank fraud. The house goes into foreclosure, the business closes permanently, and you deal with the legal consequences alone. The silence stretched for several minutes as Jake wrestled with the reality that his charm and excuses couldn't solve this crisis. For the first time in his life, he faced genuine accountability with no escape routes or family safety nets. When he finally looked up, tears were streaming down his face. I never wanted this responsibility, he said quietly. I knew you were better at the business stuff, but Mom and Dad kept saying I was supposed to take over. I was scared to tell them I didn't think I could handle it. The admission was the first honest thing Jake had said in years. Beneath the confidence and entitlement was a young man who'd been thrust into a role he'd never felt qualified to fill, trying desperately to live up to expectations that had been imposed rather than earned. I screwed up everything, he continued. Madison was right to leave. Her father was right about me, and I've ruined what Dad spent 30 years building. For a moment, I saw the scared little brother who'd always lived in the shadow of our parents' expectations, rather than the irresponsible heir who destroyed our inheritance. Jake, I said gently, you can fix this. It'll take years of work, and you'll have to prove yourself every single day. But the opportunity is still there if you're willing to take it. He signed the agreement with trembling hands, officially transferring everything back to the brother who'd been excluded from their parents' original will. But more importantly, he was accepting responsibility for the first time in his life and committing to earning, rather than inheriting his future role in the family legacy. That evening, I called Sarah with news that our plans to start a construction business had accelerated dramatically. Instead of building something from scratch, we were inheriting the challenge of rebuilding Miller & Sons from the wreckage Jake had created. Are you sure you want to take on his debts and problems? She asked. It's not just about Jake, I explained. It's about preserving what Mom and Dad built and taking care of the employees and customers who depended on our family's integrity. This is my chance to prove that the values they taught me were more valuable than the inheritance they gave him. The golden child's reign was over, and the real work of reconstruction was about to begin. 18 months later, I stood in the renovated office of Miller & Sons, watching our newest crew finish the final details on Riverside Medical Center's expansion project. The same shopping center where Jake's inexperienced workers had caused massive damage was now showcasing our commitment to quality and reliability under competent leadership. Carlos Rodriguez had rejoined the company as lead foreman, bringing with him 3 experienced roofers who'd left during Jake's mismanagement. Linda Walsh had become our strongest advocate, referring new clients and serving on our customer advisory board. The business that had nearly collapsed was generating $2,800,000 in annual revenue, more than double what it had produced during Dad's final years. Jake was part of that success, but in ways he'd never expected when he inherited everything. Currently working as a site supervisor, he'd spent his first 8 months learning basic construction skills from Carlos's crew, starting each day at 5:30 a.m. and ending with concrete evidence of honest work completed. The 90-day treatment program had addressed both his alcohol dependency and the financial irresponsibility that had destroyed his inheritance. Counseling helped him understand how our parents' favoritism had actually damaged him by creating unrealistic expectations and preventing him from developing genuine competence. They meant well, Jake told me during one of our weekly progress meetings, but giving me things I hadn't earned made me think I was entitled to success without effort. When real challenges came, I had no idea how to handle them. His transformation hadn't been smooth or immediate. There were moments of resentment when he struggled with physical labor or felt frustrated by his entry-level position. But gradually, as he experienced the satisfaction of completing projects successfully and earning respect from coworkers, Jake began developing the work ethic that our parents had assumed he possessed naturally. Amy Foster, a third-grade teacher he'd met at a community volunteer project, provided emotional support that was based on appreciating his character development rather than his inherited status. Their relationship grew slowly, built on shared values and genuine compatibility instead of financial attraction or social positioning. Amy sees me for who I'm becoming, Jake explained, not who I used to pretend to be. Sarah and I had married in a simple ceremony at the family home, which we'd renovated extensively after clearing Jake's accumulated debts. The mortgage was paid off, and we'd added a workshop where I could plan projects, and Sarah could study for her master's degree in healthcare administration. Our first child was due in March, and we'd already decided that Miller and Sons would someday offer opportunities for the next generation based on demonstrated ability rather than automatic inheritance. The business itself had evolved beyond traditional residential roofing to include commercial construction and emergency restoration services. We employed 43 people, including apprentices from Front Range Community College, who learned practical skills while earning competitive wages. Frank Morrison had left Home Depot to become our operations manager, bringing decades of construction experience and business insight. Henderson and Associates handled our legal work, and Richard Henderson often commented that the company was more professionally managed than many businesses twice our size. Most importantly, we'd restored the reputation for integrity and craftsmanship that had made Miller and Sons successful for 3 decades. Customers knew they could trust our estimates, depend on our schedules, and expect quality results that would last for years. The financial success was satisfying, but the personal relationships were more meaningful. Carlos had bought a house and was planning his own wedding. Former employees who'd found other jobs during Jake's mismanagement had returned, bringing additional skills and client connections. Jake himself had become one of our most reliable supervisors, combining his business education with hard-earned field experience. His natural charisma, properly channeled through competence and humility, made him effective at training new employees and managing customer relationships. During our annual employee meeting, Jake stood before the entire company and publicly acknowledged his past mistakes and current commitment to earning rather than expecting respect. I inherited this business without understanding its value or taking responsibility for its reputation, he said. Trent saved what I nearly destroyed, and every day I work here is an opportunity to prove I deserve a second chance. The applause was genuine, reflecting appreciation for his honesty and recognition of his development over the past 18 months. But the most meaningful moment came during a private conversation after that meeting. Jake asked me to serve as best man at his wedding to Amy, and he presented a proposal that demonstrated how completely his perspective had changed. "I want to buy back into the business like we agreed," he said, but I think the percentage should be based on actual contribution rather than our original timeline. Whatever ownership I earn should reflect the value I've actually added, not just time served. The offer showed understanding that partnerships must be based on merit rather than family relationships or inherited expectations. Jake was requesting the opportunity to earn equity through demonstrated performance, instead of claiming it through renegotiated terms. 6 months later, we celebrated the completion of Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital's new emergency wing, the largest project in Miller & Sons history. Jake supervised the roofing installation, Carlos managed the structural work, and I coordinated with architects and hospital administrators. Standing on the roof where Sarah worked as head nurse, looking out over Denver's growing skyline, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. Our parents' decision to exclude me from their will had initially felt like betrayal and rejection, but ultimately, it had forced me to discover capabilities I might never have developed while living in Jake's shadow. The inheritance that seemed so important had proved to be temporary and easily lost through poor judgment. But the values, skills, and relationships that formed the foundation of genuine success couldn't be taken away or transferred to someone else. Jake joined me on the roof as the crew packed up for the day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mom and Dad had divided the inheritance differently?" he asked. I considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we both ended up exactly where we needed to be," I said. "You learned responsibility and self-respect. I learned independence and leadership. The business is stronger because we both had to earn our roles instead of simply accepting them." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Amy asked me what I'd tell our kids about inheritance and family businesses." "What did you say?" "That the greatest inheritance isn't money or property," he replied. "It's the crisis that forces you to discover who you really are and what you're capable of becoming." That evening, Sarah and I sat in our backyard, watching our 6-month-old daughter, Sarah Elena, play in the grass, where Jake and I had once built forts and dreamed about our futures. The family home that had once represented exclusion and favoritism had become a symbol of redemption and earned success. The text message that had started this crisis still lived in my phone, a reminder of how quickly inherited wealth could evaporate without the character and competence necessary to preserve it. But it also represented the moment when both Jake and I began building lives based on our own choices rather than our parents' expectations. Miller & Sons now stood as evidence that family businesses could thrive across generations when leadership was earned rather than inherited, when values were demonstrated through actions rather than promises, and when second chances were offered to those willing to do the work necessary to deserve them. The golden child had learned to shine through his own efforts, and the overlooked son had discovered that being excluded from one inheritance had prepared him to build something even more valuable, a legacy based on integrity, competence, and the courage to hold family members accountable to the same standards expected from everyone else. Sometimes the greatest gift parents can give their children isn't what they leave them in their will, but the strength they develop when they're forced to prove themselves worthy of the family name through their own decisions and dedication. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where being overlooked or underestimated actually became the catalyst for discovering your true potential? I'd love to hear your stories about how setbacks led to unexpected opportunities in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to support more content about family dynamics and personal growth. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly stories about overcoming challenges and building meaningful success, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that our greatest inheritance is often the strength we develop when we're forced to stand on our own. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I wish you the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is being forced to prove we deserve the opportunities we seek.